When we think of American revolutions, we picture 1776, the Boston Tea Party, or perhaps the Civil War. But a century before the Declaration of Independence, colonial Virginia experienced a rebellion so threatening to the ruling class that it fundamentally restructured society to prevent it from ever happening again. This was Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, and it wasn't a fight for independence or abstract principles. It was a raw, violent class war that exposed the fragility of elite power and forced America's wealthy to choose between their profits and their survival. The story begins not with heroism, but with desperation. By the 1670s, colonial Virginia had become a pressure cooker of social tension. The colony's economy ran on tobacco, and tobacco required land and labor. The labor came from indentured servants, tens of thousands of them, both white Europeans and Africans, who had traded years of brutal servitude for the promise of freedom and 50 acres of land when their contracts expired. But here's the problem the colonial elite had anticipated. These servants actually survived and expected their promises to be kept. Each year, hundreds of former servants completed their terms and demanded their land. They found themselves in a colony where every acre of good coastal land was already claimed by the same wealthy planters who had worked them nearly to death. These planters controlled not just the land, but the government, the courts, and the military. They were Governor William Berkeley's circle, men who had grown rich on tobacco and saw no reason to share. The former servants, now free but landless, faced a crucial choice. They could stay on the coast, working for wages that barely kept them alive, renting land from the same masters they'd just escaped, watching the wealth they'd been promised evaporate. Or they could push west into the frontiers, onto lands claimed by Native American tribes, who had already been pushed back repeatedly by colonial expansion. Thousands chose the frontier. They settled illegally on native lands, cleared forests, planted tobacco, and dared anyone to remove them. When native tribes fought back, defending their territory against these squatters, the frontiersmen demanded that the colonial government protect them with military force. They wanted the colonial militia to drive out the Native Americans entirely, opening vast territories up for settlement. Governor Berkeley refused. This wasn't compassion for Native Americans, it was cold calculation. Berkeley and his inner circle profited enormously from the fur trade with native tribes. A war would disrupt this lucrative business. Moreover, Berkeley saw no reason to spend colonial resources protecting poor squatters, who contributed little to the tax base. From his perspective, in the comfortable coastal plantation region, the frontier settlers were troublemakers who had created their own problems. To the frontiersmen, Berkeley's refusal looked like something far worse than neglect. It looked like a government that existed solely to protect the interests of the wealthy, while leaving ordinary people to die. They saw their taxes funding a government that wouldn't defend them, a legislature that passed laws to benefit planters, and a governor who lived in luxury while they faced starvation and attacks. The class divide couldn't have been clearer. Into this volatile situation stepped Nathaniel Bacon. Here's where the story gets complicated. Because Bacon was no champion of the poor, he was 29 years old, university educated at Cambridge, wealthy enough to purchase a substantial plantation immediately upon arriving in Virginia, and related by marriage to Governor Berkeley himself. Bacon was, by every measure, a member of the elite he would soon rebel against. But Bacon was also ambitious, impulsive, and hungry for power that Berkeley's establishment denied him. When he demanded a military commission to fight Native Americans and Berkeley refused, Bacon didn't accept the snub. Instead, he recognized an opportunity. Hundreds of angry, armed, desperate men on the frontier needed a leader, and Bacon needed a power base. It was a marriage of convenience that would nearly destroy the colony. In 1676, Bacon gathered a force of around 300 men and marched into native territory without authorization. His army was extraordinary for its composition. Wealthy planters fought alongside indentured servants who hadn't yet completed their terms. Free blacks marched with enslaved Africans. Poor white farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with men who had nothing but the weapons in their hands. What united them wasn't ideology, but anger and the promise of land. Bacon's forces attacked native villages indiscriminately, often targeting peaceful tribes with no connection to any frontier conflicts. The violence was brutal and unjustified, but it was also popular. Finally, someone was acting while the government sat idle. When Berkeley declared Bacon a rebel and a traitor, it only increased Bacon's support. He wasn't just fighting Native Americans anymore, he was fighting the colonial establishment itself. What happened next sent shockwaves through the ruling class. Bacon marched his growing army to Jamestown and forced the House of Burgesses at gunpoint to grant him his commission and pass laws he demanded. There weren't just military measures, they were direct attacks on elite privileges. Bacon demanded expanded voting rights, term limits for officials, and lower taxes. He called for redistribution of Berkeley's lands and the lands of his supporters. This was class warfare made explicit. Berkeley tried to rally support, but he discovered something terrifying. Outside his circle of wealthy planters, almost no one would defend him. The poor had no loyalty to a government that had never served them. When Berkeley fled Jamestown, Bacon returned in 1676 with an army that now numbered in the hundreds and included dozens of enslaved people who had been promised freedom if they fought. They burned Jamestown to the ground. The colonial capital, symbol of English authority and planter power, went up in flames while Bacon's multiracial army cheered. For several months, Bacon controlled most of Virginia. The normal social order collapsed completely. Enslaved people fought as free men. Servants gave orders to former masters. The class hierarchy that had seemed permanent and natural revealed itself as nothing more than force and custom, both of which had evaporated. The elite were terrified, and not just of losing property or power. What frightened them most was the composition of Bacon's army. Poor whites and black laborers, free and enslaved, had united against their common oppressors. They had discovered that they shared more interest with each other than with the planters who controlled them. This was the nightmare scenario, a class-conscious alliance across racial lines that could overthrow the entire colonial system. Then Bacon died. On October 1676, probably from dysentery, the rebellion's leader succumbed to disease. Without him, the coalition fractured. Berkeley returned with reinforcements and exacted brutal revenge, hanging 23 rebels without trial. The physical rebellion ended, but its psychological impact on the elite had just begun. The planters understood that they had barely survived. Berkeley was recalled to England in disgrace. But the larger question remained. How could the elite prevent another Bacon's rebellion? How could they ensure that poor whites and black laborers would never again unite against them? The solution they devised was elegant and evil. Divide the working class by race. In the decades following the rebellion, Virginia's legislature passed a comprehensive series of laws designed to drive a wedge between poor whites and enslaved blacks, who had so recently fought side by side. They transformed slavery from a sometimes temporary condition into a permanent, hereditary status defined entirely by race. They gave poor whites legal privileges and social standing that elevated them above all blacks, no matter how small those privileges were. While servants gained new rights, they couldn't be beaten as severely. They could bear arms. They could receive guaranteed land and supplies upon completing their terms. Every one of these rights was explicitly denied to African Americans. Most brilliantly, the elite made poor whites the enforcers of the system. They became overseers, slave catchers, and members of slave patrols. They were given a stake, however small, in maintaining racial slavery. A poor white farmer might own no land and live in poverty, but he could look at an enslaved person and feel superior. He might be exploited by the planter class, but at least he wasn't black. This was the elite's genius. They redirected class resentment into racial hatred. Poor whites, who might have united with enslaved blacks against their common economic oppression, instead identified with wealthy whites based solely on skin color. The cross-racial working-class alliance that had terrified the planters during Bacon's rebellion became unthinkable. The strategy worked devastatingly well. For the next 2 centuries, poor whites in the South would consistently vote against their own economic interests, oppose labor organizing that might benefit them, and violently suppress any hint of black advancement, all to maintain a racial hierarchy that primarily benefited the elite. The same planters who had nearly been overthrown in 1676, and their descendants would rule the South largely unchallenged until the Civil War. Bacon's rebellion revealed something that America's ruling class had never forgotten. Their power depends not on being stronger than the working class. They will always be outnumbered, but on preventing the working class from recognizing their shared interests. The greatest threat to elite power isn't external enemies or economic crisis. It's class consciousness, the moment when working people look past their superficial differences and recognize their common exploitation. The ashes of Jamestown taught America's elite a lesson they've applied ever since. Divide and conquer. Use race, religion, region, or any other difference to keep working people fighting against each other instead of fighting their exploiters. Make the poorest white person feel superior to the richest black person. Give people someone to look down on so they won't look up to see who's really controlling them. Bacon's rebellion was America's original class war, and the elite won not by defending the rebellion, but by ensuring such a rebellion would never happen again. They didn't need to eliminate class conflict. They just needed to disguise it as racial conflict. 350 years later, we're still living with the consequences of that strategy, still struggling against divisions created to terrify the elite and control everyone else.